and that was, of course, 9/11. Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, he doesn't hold press conferences. He's very rarely interviewed. He recently wrote an op-ed that I'm going to talk about in a little while. But he did make one television appearance right after 9/11, and you might be able to guess the network he appeared on. You know, Fox News. You might be able to guess the show. O'Reilly Factor. So Eric Prince is on the O'Reilly Factor, and he was talking about the Federal Air Marshal Program. And at the time there was this debate, should we have armed marshals on every flight, etc. But Prince also said something that was fascinating. He said on that program, I was starting to get a little cynical about how seriously people took the business of security and training. Now, Eric Prince said, the phone is ringing off the hook. One of the early calls that came into Blackwater was from the Central Intelligence Agency, which contracted Eric Prince's men to send a small team of Special Forces operators inside of Afghanistan during the early stages of U.S. operations there. They positioned themselves near a CIA outpost in Shkin, near the border with Pakistan. Eric Prince himself went over with that Blackwater team. That, to my knowledge, is the first time that we see Blackwater crossing the line from being the sportsman's paradise and a training facility to being an all-out mercenary force. But the real serious money for Blackwater wouldn't start pouring in until U.S. tanks rolled into Baghdad in March of 2003. When the U.S. began occupying Iraq, the Bush administration deployed the largest army of private personnel ever deployed in a modern war zone, alongside the official occupation force. During the 1991 so-called Gulf War, you had a ratio of 60 soldiers to every one contractor. Right now, we're almost at a 1-to-1 ratio. This is not some accident of history. This was an intentional plan that was set in motion in 1993 when Dick Cheney was the defense secretary under George H.W. Bush. He commissioned a division of Halliburton, the company he would go on to head, to do a study on how to privatize the military bureaucracy. That accelerated the use of the logistical civilian program known as LOGCAP. So KBR is the biggest LOGCAP contractor now in Iraq. The Clinton administration picked up Cheney's ball. While Cheney was heading Halliburton, Clinton was accelerating the privatization of the military and the national security apparatus of the United States. And Cheney was heading Halliburton and hanging out at the American Enterprise Institute, and Rumsfeld was at the American Enterprise Institute, and they were pressuring, as it was portrayed in the press, pressuring Clinton to sign the Iraq Liberation Act, and of course he did that. And so you see that trajectory. This wasn't something that Bush invented. This was something that was bipartisan. And so when the tanks roll in, they have this army almost 1-to-1 of contractors to soldiers. And they send in a neoconservative / neoliberal, quote-unquote, terror expert. Of course, it takes one to know one, Paul Bremer, who hits the ground in Iraq with the it appeared to be the sole objective of destroying the country, destroying its economy, destroying the military, destroying civil society in Iraq, and creating bedlam and chaos. So Bremer hits the ground. He, of course, had worked for Henry Kissinger, one of the biggest terrorists in the world, and he hits the ground running in Iraq. But instead of the U.S. military protecting Paul Bremer, they give a no-bid contract to a private mercenary company for $27 million, and that company was Blackwater USA. So Blackwater would be charged with the all-important job of keeping the most hated man in Iraq alive during his time there. One of the earliest things that Paul Bremer did was to institute, and veterans know the consequences of this, Bremer instituted a disastrous policy known as debathification. They were so intent on making this comparison between Saddam Hussein and Hitler, denazification, debathification. And it all sounds, it sounds like one could make an argument that it made sense. You're just going to take out Saddam Hussein's top cadre of people and then, and punish them and put them on trial. No, what debathification meant was that nurses, engineers, teachers, all of these people who had any loose affiliation with the Ba'ath Party. I spent a lot of time in Saddam Hussein's Iraq. It was very difficult to find someone who had not, at some point or another in life, been forced to sign some kind of paper supporting the Ba'ath Party. They fired hundreds of thousands of workers who were simple civilians who were going about their daily lives. They fired people from the Ministry of Education. They fired the people who were in charge of reconstruction projects in the country. But also they fired 250,000 Iraqi soldiers. From one day to the next, they stopped paying them. We quote one senior U.S. official in the book as saying that it was the day we made 250,000 armed enemies in Iraq. Some of the leaders of the Iraqi military marched on the gates of the Green Zone and they said, this is a disaster. You can't stop paying our men. They'll all join the ranks of the resistance and rise up against you. Of course, no one listens. And so we saw a direct escalation in the attacks against U.S. forces that occurred right after the de-Baathification policies were implemented. And so as Bremer is running around earning himself nicknames like Little Saddam and Saddam after Saddam, it's Blackwater that's protecting him and keeping him alive. And in fact, when Bremer skulked out of Baghdad after a year in the country, he handed over sovereignty to an Iraqi government. And then he gave a thank you gift to Blackwater and other contractors, as they're called, the 130,000 shadow army in Iraq. He issued an edict known as Order 17, which granted sweeping immunity to all contractors from prosecution in Iraqi courts. That's a strange definition of sovereignty. And so Bremer leaves the country. And if you think about the psychology of a private company guarding Bremer versus the U.S. military, it goes something like this. If the military is guarding Paul Bremer or Zalmay Khalilzad or John Negroponte, and they get killed, there will be an investigation. It'll be a scandal. Maybe there will be a court-martial if they figure out that someone did something really outrageous. But nothing much is going to come of it. There's not going to be high-stakes consequences for the military. But if a private company loses Paul Bremer, it would wipe out their business. And the very fact that Blackwater kept Bremer alive, the most hated man in Iraq, for a year, they've now used that as a marketing tool to win more business. If you go to Blackwater Security Consulting's website, you see Paul Bremer's face all over the website. And the message is clear. If we can keep him alive, we can do anything for your government or your business in Iraq. So Blackwater, that was the gold rush moment for Blackwater, was that initial contract. Now I told you about that Fallujah ambush at the beginning where those 4 guys were killed. They were killed on March 31st, 2004. On April 1st, 2004, Erik Prince hires the Alexander Strategy Group, which is at the time was one of the most powerful Republican lobbying firms on K Street. It was one of the jewels of Tom DeLay's K Street project. The Alexander Strategy Group had been founded and was staffed by former senior staffers of Tom DeLay. Jack Abramoff was connected to the Alexander Strategy Group. It was a major power broker. Within days of hiring the Alexander Strategy Group, Blackwater executives, Erik Prince and others, find themselves in a series of face-to-face meetings with the men who literally ran Congress in both the House and in the Senate. March 31st, 2004, 4 Blackwater operatives killed in Fallujah, Iraq. April 1st, 2004, Alexander Strategy Group hired. By June of 2004, Blackwater was awarded an incredible $320 million contract to provide so-called diplomatic security services in Iraq. It has now risen out of the Great Dismal Swamp of North Carolina and the rubble of 9/11 to become one of the most powerful private actors in the so-called War on Terror. The number 2 man at Blackwater is a guy named J. Cofer Black. It's probably a name that some of you have heard. J. Cofer Black is one of the most well-known spies in U.S. history, 30 years in the Central Intelligence Agency. He began his work in Africa, where he was in Rhodesia and other places, and then he was in Sudan in the mid-1990s, where he was once marked for death by Osama bin Laden. And while he was there, it came up with a plot to kill bin Laden and to throw his body over the gates of the Iranian embassy to try to make it appear as though the Iranians had killed Osama bin Laden. Cofer Black was a well-known spy, and on 9/11, he was the head of the Central Intelligence Agency's Counterterrorism Center. He was the top counterterrorism official at the CIA, the man who would be tasked with the hunt for bin Laden. Great job. So he goes in on September 13th, 2001, and he meets in the White House Situation Room with President Bush, and he's throwing papers on the ground as he's describing how he's going to insert special forces inside of Afghanistan. And he says, Mr. President, when we're through with them, they're going to have flies crawling across their eyeballs. Flies crawling across their eyeballs. He became known as the flies on the eyeball guy within the administration. He goes over to Moscow with Deputy Secretary of State Dick Armitage, Colin Powell's deputy, ahead of the invasion of Afghanistan, and they meet with the Russian diplomats, and the Russians start to warn them about the Soviet experience in Afghanistan, and Cofer Black shoots back at them, we're going to put their heads on pikes. In fact, his orders, this is a man seemingly obsessed with corporal mutilation, his orders to the jawbreaker team from the CIA that went into Afghanistan initially was literally to find Osama bin Laden, take a machete, whack off his head, put it in a box on dry ice, and bring it back so he could present it to President Bush. And when he gave those orders to the jawbreaker team, the head of the Jawbreaker team says, the orders are crystal clear, Kofor. We can get a cardboard box. I don't know what we're going to do about dry ice, but we'll make it work. Kofor Black, and as I'm telling you this, remember, he's now the #2 man at Blackwater, and Blackwater has an aviation division of more than 20 aircraft. Kofor Black was perhaps the central figure in escalating the use of what are known as extraordinary renditions, government-sanctioned kidnap and torture programs, where people are snatched off the streets of cities around the world, zipped up, shackled to the seat of an airplane, sent to a third country hellhole to be tortured, unless you think it just happens in Afghanistan and Kandahar. Elsewhere, Maher Arar was abducted at JFK Airport and sent to Syria, where he was systematically tortured under that program. So Kofor Black is the man who stands in front of Congress and says there's a before 9/11 and an after 9/11, and after 9/11 the gloves come off. It's a chilling statement from this man who's now #2 at Blackwater USA. In fact, Mitt Romney just tapped him to be his senior counterterrorism advisor for his presidential campaign. Kofor Black's most recent initiative is something that is a glimpse into the future, and that is privatized intelligence. Kofor Black is, and another senior Blackwater executive, Robert Richer, who's the former deputy director of operations at the CIA, and then another former senior CIA official, Enrique Rick Prado, are the three people at the center of something called Total Intelligence Solutions. It's like a privatized CIA, and it's being bankrolled by Eric Prince at Blackwater. These frightening individuals who talk about chopping off heads, gloves coming off, who support and have actively participated in the torture and abduction of people, are now privatizing their CIA careers and marketing them to Fortune 500 companies. This is an extraordinarily frightening development, and we see it as a trend. These private intelligence companies are popping up across the board. There are a number of other figures at Blackwater that I could talk about. I realize I'm short on time, so I want to run through a couple of other things that I think are crucial to discuss. One is that Eric Prince wrote an op-ed called "Nothing Mercenary About Blackwater Activities." He finally speaks up, and he says, clearly the mercenary label is intended to polarize the discussion and craft the most negative image possible of Blackwater. The highest authority on rhetoric, the Oxford English Dictionary, however, defines mercenary as, quote, a professional soldier serving a foreign power. Blackwater does not now, nor has it ever, provided security services for or on behalf of any country other than the United States of America. All right. Well, I find this fascinating that this is the definition that Eric Prince uses to describe a mercenary. He says it's a professional soldier serving a foreign government. Professional soldier serving a foreign power. Blackwater, beginning in 2003, started working with a recruiter in Chile, a guy who had been in Pinochet's military. I tracked him down and interviewed him for 2.5 hours, and he explained to me how the whole Latin American recruitment operation worked for Blackwater. This guy, his name is Jose Miguel Pizarro Ovalle. He starts working with Blackwater. He opens up some camps in Chile. He puts out ads in the paper seeking former commandos, special forces operators. In Chile, Pinochet's man is now looking for former special forces operators and commandos to work for an American company in Iraq. The day after he put that ad in the paper, he had over 1,000 people respond to it. He sets up these camps. He begins evaluating soldiers. He tells me 3 Blackwater officials come down, and they evaluate the soldiers. By February of 2004, Chilean mercenaries were heading up to Moyock, North Carolina, before being sent over to Iraq. In all, this man told me that he provided 756 Chilean mercenaries to Blackwater, Triple Canopy, and a couple of other companies. Now, what's interesting about this is that Chile, of course, knows suffering well at the hands of the United States economically, militarily, the rise of the brutal regime of Pinochet, the devastating economic policies of the Chicago Boys. But what's interesting about Chile in 2003 was that it was a rotating member of the UN Security Council opposing the invasion of Iraq. 92% of Chileans were against the invasion and occupation of Iraq. Chile said no to the coalition of the willing, and so the Bush administration turns to Blackwater and the coalition of the willing, and they go in and they violate the sovereignty of the nation of Chile, and they hire up their thuggish, human rights abusing soldiers that are leftovers from the Pinochet era, and they send them over to Iraq to work as part of the occupation force. They also went into Colombia and they recruited Colombian mercenaries, similar operation, putting out the ads, always promising more money than you're going to end up getting paid. The Colombians arrive in Baghdad, in the green zone, and they finally read the final contract. It had been changed a number of times, and they find out they're getting paid $34 a day. Some of the best paid U.S. mercenaries get $1,000 a day. The Colombians, $34 a day. The Bulgarians working for Blackwater start laughing at the Colombians and saying no one comes here for $1,000 a month. So the Colombians staged a strike of sorts inside of the green zone. Well, fast forward a little bit in time here. A couple of weeks ago, the Colombian recruiter who sent them over to Iraq was gunned down in the streets of Bogota. So what we see here is an insidious system where you want to avoid having a draft in your country. You want to keep it off the table for political reasons. You can't convince the world to participate in your global wars of conquest. And so what you do is you make the whole world your recruiting ground. You use these private companies to go into the poorest countries of the world, countries that have been systematically destabilized by the United States, and you hire up the poor of the developing world and you deploy them to kill and be killed in Iraq against the poor and suffering of Iraq. And the fact is that there's also a racist element to this too in the pay structure of them. We've got American mercenaries, U.S. mercenaries in Iraq right now. They make more money than Secretary Gates. They make more money than the commanding generals. To tell you how pervasive this privatization agenda is, General David Petraeus in January, when he testified in front of the Senate, admitted that he, on his last tour in Iraq, had been guarded not by the U.S. military, but by British mercenaries. And so we have a situation right now where we had years of Republican-dominated Congress, and now a lot of people thought, oh, the Democrats are in the Congress and everything's going to be great and they're going to stop the war. And instead, all they've continued to do is to fund it at a 100% level, in fact, at times offering the president even more money than he was asking for. There are a handful of Democrats who are nobly taking on the issue of the privatization of war, but you know their names probably. And here's the fact, that we have the Uniform Code of Military Justice being applied to soldiers, and we have almost no law whatsoever being applied to the contractors. So the Democrats come up with a plan, and this is their idea. We're going to send an FBI field unit over to Iraq. So we're going to deploy more forces in Iraq. And somehow this FBI field unit is going to monitor the activities of 130,000 private personnel in the war zone. I mean, have you ever heard of a more ridiculous plan? We have enough trouble keeping track of what the official U.S. military does. The Democrats' best laid plan is to send the FBI over to Baghdad to monitor the mercenaries, men who are sent to places no one else will go or wants to go. And I interviewed the person who thought up this legislation, David Price, who's a Democrat from North Carolina. And I said to him, Representative Price, let me ask you, who's going to protect the investigators as they go around Iraq? How are you going to interview Iraqi victims of contractors if they're in, say, Hilla or Bakuba or places that are difficult for the U.S. military to get into? Who's going to do the translating for all of these investigators? And then who's going to arrest these contractors, many of them former Navy SEALs, and then send them back to the United States where they're going to be prosecuted in a U.S. court? Well, those are very good questions. As though he had never thought of that before. And so that's the state of affairs when it comes to the privatization of war agenda in the mainstream of the Democratic Party in the U.S. Congress. I was actually invited to testify in front of Congress, in front of the Defense Appropriations Committee, and the night before I testified, I got a call from the committee saying that at least 10 of the most powerful private war companies in the United States had called the committee and demanded that I not testify. And then they said, well, okay, if he's going to testify, then one of our lobbyists has to appear. You know, their lobbyists are constantly on Capitol Hill. I've been there like 3 times in my life. And so Jim Moran, a Democrat from Virginia, very bravely said to them, no, we're going to do this and we're going to have this hearing. And so we had that hearing, and it was web streamed. C-SPAN, of course, didn't cover it. And the only people in the room besides the Democrats on the committee was one lone Republican congressman. The Republicans boycotted, Jack Kingston, the single most conservative member of the Congress from Georgia. And he and I got into an argument about the religious right. He was very offended at my characterization of Eric Prince as a radical right-wing Christian.